Well, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Jim Brett of the New England Council, and I hope that each of you tuning in today, as well as your families and your colleagues, continue to stay safe and healthy during these challenging times. It's hard to believe we're now in our third month of virtual programs, and I'm pleased to report that today's has drawn our largest audience so far. But before I introduce our guest today, let me just take a moment to tell you about a few other virtual events that we have planned in the next few days and the next week. This Thursday, we're looking forward to the fourth installment of our Leading in a Crisis series. This time, we're taking a look at the banking industry that our guest who has a great deal of background on, and how they have responded to the crisis, with leaders from Eastern Bank and People's United Bank and the Federal Home Loan Bank. Next week, we'll hold virtual programs with New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, as well as Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. The following week, we'll hear from Senator Susan Collins and Representative Joe Kennedy. But today, we are pleased to welcome the Honorable Elizabeth Warren, the senior United States Senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. As you know, she's serving her second term representing the Bay State after a very distinguished career as a law professor and a nationally known consumer advocate. On Capitol Hill, she serves on several important committees where she is able to advocate on a range of critical issues for our region, including the Armed Services Committee, the Banking Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee, and the Special Committee on Aging. In recent weeks, she has worked tirelessly with her colleagues in the New England delegation to secure much needed federal assistance for our region as we continue to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on our economy. As she has throughout her time in elected office, she has focused on oversight and transparency around federal assistance to corporations, on protecting American consumers, and on supporting middle-class families. As Congress now considers its fourth round of major relief and economic stimulus legislation, we are honored that Senator Warren could take the time to join us today to share her insights on the process and the timing, as well as her priorities for what any future legislation should include. So with that, I thank all of you, members of the New England Council, for joining us today. And I am pleased to hand it over to the United States Senator, the senior senator from the great state of Massachusetts, Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Oh, thank you, Jim. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. And thank you to everyone who's joining us on this conversation today. I am grateful to have all of you as a partner, and particularly now. You know, these are very difficult times for our communities, for our nation, and for the entire world. While we are grappling with COVID-19 pandemic, we are also facing the very real and very raw reaction to racial violence and the consequences of generations of systemic racism that continue to plague our country. And we can't talk about one issue without talking about the other. You know, first on the response to the pandemic, as you know, Congress is currently working on the fourth stimulus package. I wanted to share some of my economic and public health priorities for the next package with you. So just to let you know, I've been focused on what we need to do to keep families afloat, not just during the pandemic, but all the way through to the other side of this economic recovery. This pandemic has disrupted local budgets as communities try to deal with unexpected costs and a steep loss in revenue. The next package must, I underline must, include financial support for states and municipalities, something the entire Massachusetts delegation and I are completely all in and fighting for. Second thing, I have released an Essential Workers Bill of Rights. This is to make sure that the people who are showing up to work every single day during this health crisis have adequate safety protections, that they have paid family and medical leave, that they get hazardous duty pay, and building that into a statute. I'm also calling for $50 billion in a child care bailout. I've introduced a bill on this with Senators Patty Murray and also Kirsten Gillibrand and Representatives Catherine Clark and Rosa DeLauro and Bobby Scott. What we're trying to do is stabilize the child care market. You know, the way I see it, child care is critical infrastructure, just like transportation, and we should think of it that way. Parents can't go back to work without reliable and affordable child care. And without emergency funding, much of the child care centers, many of them are going to close their doors, not just temporarily, but forever. We also need to provide immediate and total relief for small businesses that are facing collapse. The program that Congress passed back in March had too little money and too much confusion. And we have seen mom and pop businesses get left behind, particularly in communities of color. That's why I have called for the SBA Inspector General to investigate the rollout of the Payroll Protection Program. We need to fix it, and we need to eliminate the cap, and we need to get relief out immediately. On the public health side, we need to provide more resources to ramp up testing and contact tracing capacity so that we can further mitigate the spread of this virus and help our economy recover. That's why I've announced a federal contact tracing initiative that is modeled off the Massachusetts program. I've announced that with Congressman Levin from Michigan. I've also introduced legislation to help boost the supply chain on basic materials like PPE and chemical reagents, the sorts of things that are needed to combat COVID-19 so that we don't face the system-wide and system-breaking challenges and shortages as this pandemic continues. So those are just some of the priorities that I have for this next package. We need to make sure that Senate Republicans come to the table, and we need to make sure that this next package includes the kinds of values that are essential to helping working families. Now, if I can, I just want to say a word about the protests that we're seeing in Massachusetts and all across the country. What's happening is the result of racist violence and white supremacy that continue to plague this country. And we need to be frank about this. The racist violence that killed George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and far too many Black men and women, it's not new in America. And we as a nation and as a human family have some serious soul searching to do. We need to make real change, starting with accountability at every stage of our criminal justice system and rethinking our approach to public safety in a way that focuses less on locking people up and more on investing in communities so that we can lift people up. We need to do more to root out racial disparities, not only in our criminal justice system, but also in healthcare and education, employment, housing, every part of society. Inequities that are even more pronounced now as Black and brown communities are hit hardest by COVID-19. Now, I believe that this is a moment when white Americans must look with all justice-loving people and come together to ask what we're doing every day to dismantle a system that has benefited white people while undervaluing and harming Black people. We cannot simply be allies. We must be anti-racists. So I am in this fight, but I'm going to need every single one of you with me on this. I need you to keep up the pressure, to keep working with your partners in other states, and to talk about why these issues are so important to ensure a healthy and an equitable recovery for our economy and for all of our communities. And I'm so glad to be here with you today, not only so I could tell you about the things I'm working on, but also so I can hear from you and get your feedback. So let me just turn this over to Jim for Q&A.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Senator. And You know, some of the items that you just mentioned that you would like to see in the Senate version of a relief stimulus bill, you were very successful in getting them in the House bill that passed the House just recently. Your nationwide tracing program, that's in the bill. You were very successful in getting the Workers' Bill of Rights in the House bill. And I think you did not mention, but you were a leader in getting in the House bill $11.5 billion in grants to groups providing emergency shelter solutions during this pandemic, which is very important. But you were the leader in getting that in that House bill, and that is desperately needed all over the country, to say the least. And I think something else that you worked on very successfully in getting it in the House bill, again, was I believe it was a federal student loan forgiveness of $10,000, which is just terrific. So you're pretty good in working the legislative process and working across the aisle and being very effective. And I think you deserve a great deal of credit for that. And I couldn't agree more on the child care, that is truly something that business community should be advocating more. I know that the chamber has been advocating, taking a lead, and they should be congratulated. But you know, Senator, I was thinking the other day, we have about 11 million positions right now that go unfilled in this country. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the large business organizations, as well as the largest employers in the country, could work together and say, let's educate the people in the inner city an opportunity to fill these jobs? Because I think that is part of what needs to be done. So many of these young men and women who live in these areas do not have the training for these positions. And if you don't have a position to work to go to, then I think that's a problem. So I think there's opportunities for government and business to work together. I don't think we should always be looking to Washington saying, what's the solution? I think all of us can play a role. So I think there's opportunities there. But I just want to thank you for your leadership on these important issues. And the pandemic, let me just start with this. You know, we all talk about pandemic as though they're numbers, 100,000 people, but you yourself, you've been personally touched by COVID-19, by your oldest brother passing away, and to know that so many people like your brother are dying all alone. They don't have anyone to hold their hand from a member of the family. And even in your particular case, you cannot even go to your brothers to share memories, share stories, have a laugh. And it's just so sad. There's so much suffering going on out there. And obviously we just send our prayers and thoughts to you, because it's not easy. Obviously he was probably your biggest supporter. He talked to you, I think, twice a day, and urged you to keep fighting. And God knows you are a great fighter and a great advocate. But our thoughts are with you during this difficult time, to say the least. So I just want to let you know that. I have a question here from a human service provider. And he says, human service providers deemed essential services are struggling to hire frontline direct care workers. With the enhanced unemployment benefits available, often the response to a job offer is, I can make more on unemployment. Would you support funds to nonprofit human service providers providing essential services such as residential care of individuals with developmental disabilities that would allow the providers to supplement wages for direct care staff to at least what is paid on unemployment?
Not only would I support it, I already have supported it. And I've gotten a part of this already in the House bill for the next stimulus package. Now, I don't want to overpromise here. We're still going to have to negotiate with the Republicans over in the Senate. And right now, Senator McConnell is saying he doesn't see any urgency for any additional relief from the federal government.
Right.
But I want you to know where I am in this fight, and that we've got a lot of folks with us. And that is that essential workers, exactly the workers you're describing, but more. You know, it's doctors and nurses, but it's also the people who are mopping the floors in the hospital. It's the people who are stocking the grocery store shelves. It's the people who are delivering things to your door, and people who are doing long distance truck deliveries, and people who are providing in-home care and congregate setting care. These are essential workers, and my view is not only should they have rights, rights to so that their employers provide them with appropriate protective gear, and that they have paid family and medical leave if they get sick, that their medical care will be covered, but also that they receive a paid boost so that they get paid commensurate with the kind of risk they're taking. These are folks who are out on the front lines, putting their own health at risk, sometimes worried about contracting something and taking it back home to their families. If they're going to take on that kind of risk so that we keep this country going, so people are still continuing to receive the care that they need, by golly, they've got our backs, we should have their backs. And I think part of that is they should be receiving a paid bump from the federal government right now. They should be receiving hazardous duty pay. And we've got this in the House bill, and I'm going to keep fighting for it to try to get it in the Senate bill as well.
Senate Majority Leader McConnell dismissed the House bill, quote, totally unserious bill.
Yeah.
That was his quote on the House bill. Are you worried about the fall coming with maybe a resurgent, maybe a wave on the COVID-19 with influenza flu coming in the fall as well? Are we going to have enough medicines and vaccines for the flu, as well as having the PPP materials for the fall as well?
Jim, I'm really worried about the fall, and I'll tell you why. I'm going to back it up a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
Back in January, it was pretty clear that there was a risk of a pandemic. The cases had already started. The reports on COVID-19 were really severe. I put out a plan back then to say, here's how we need to be approaching this. Because when you think about an epidemic like this, it's so important to plan for it in advance and to deal with it before it gets out of hand. Now, as you know, the response of the White House was to say, there's nothing here to see, there's nothing to do. They refused to put plans in place other than to order masks for themselves. And so we ended up, as the crisis unfolded, with states bidding against each other for masks. I talked with Charlie Baker about this. Massachusetts couldn't get what we needed. And all we were doing was driving the price up, and people were struggling for the supplies. We shut things down for 3 months. People sheltered in place. We're starting just slightly to open it. But that 3 months should have been a period of time to put plans in place so that we're not just playing catch up day by day by day. We should have been using, and we should use now, the Defense Production Act so that we get enough masks manufactured. There's enough protective gear, enough swabs, enough tests, the things we know we're going to need down the line. And we should have used the lockdown period and be using this period now to be planning that out, to be strengthening the supply chain, to be stockpiling what we're going to need. Because I fear that when another wave of this hits, and this is what the epidemiologists say is likely to happen, that we are going to continue to be underprepared. And to be underprepared in a pandemic costs lives, and it costs livelihoods. It is bad for our economy and bad for our health. So I'm very worried about this, Jim, and pushing as hard as I can for more preparation.
And with the flu season coming upon us too, it could be a double whammy.
The flu season, and you know, Jim, people have put off healthcare treatment that they need during this past 3 months. And so there's going to be more and more pressure on our healthcare system as people start to realize that circumstances get more acute, people need help, they're coming back into the doctors. We want not to overwhelm our healthcare system with the flu, with COVID-19, and with all the other medical problems. But you want to get something done, you need a plan, and that's what's missing right now.
Right. I have a question for you under supply chain. The
Sure.
question is, we've seen the policy discussion arise of shifting dependence away from China on medical and pharmaceutical supplies in light of the COVID pandemic.
Mhm.
As you know, New England is home to many defense companies that support military programs. Do you also see a similar discussion in the Senate of shifting defense supply chains away from China as well in the near future?
So that's a good question. And the answer is yes. I think there's a recognition by the committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, and the Congress that the defense industrial base and our supply chain is vulnerable in multiple sectors. You know, the administration's own defense industrial base study that was completed in the fall of 2018 confirms this. In the long run, it makes our pharmaceutical supply chain stronger if we have domestic sources of drug ingredients, the kinds of things that are made right here in New England, for instance. At the same time, creating domestic manufacturing capability for things like micro electronics at scale, it's an enormous endeavor. But this issue certainly has Congress's attention. And next week, we'll be doing our markup. You know, I'm on the Senate Armed Services Committee. We'll be doing our markup for the National Defense Authorization Act. And I believe supply chain is a big part of what we're going to be talking about. I know I've got proposals on that, and so do others, because we need to pay much more attention to our supply chain and strengthening our supply chain here at home.
And just one other question on armed services. As Congress prepares to consider the fiscal 21 NDAA that you just mentioned, there has been discussion, especially in the House, about seeking to reduce the amount spent to recapitalize America's strategic weapon programs and divert that spending to other areas. What is your take on this question? And do you see a distinction between the question of spending on strategic weapon programs and spending on the infrastructure that allows us to securely maintain communications with our strategic assets?
So I really appreciate the distinction, because I think that's a very important distinction. Look, the administration has requested a $2.8 billion increase for nuclear weapons this year. That is nearly a 25% increase over their projection from last year. Now, set aside the fact that the National Nuclear Security Administration will actually find it difficult to spend that much unplanned increase, to spend that in a responsible fashion. And consider the fact that this administration has requested this extra $2.8 billion at the same time that 40 million Americans are unemployed and more than 100,000 people have died from the coronavirus pandemic. It has never been clearer to me that our priorities are completely out of whack, and they don't reflect the threats that people actually face in their lives. So I would like to see some adjustments in our spending here.
Great. Question under energy and the environment. What are the prospects for extension to the investment tax credit and the production tax credit, both of which are applied to renewable energy projects as a form of green stimulus, help build the smarter economy of the future?
So, you know, I'm going to keep pushing, others are going to keep pushing so that we're getting enough support in on green energy. I think that one of the things that has started to shift a little bit is that we are pulling in some Republicans on the notion of resilience, that green energy is not only environmentally friendly, it also helps us build a more resilient power source, power supply all around the country. And I'm hopeful that we're going to continue to support that. I am also hopeful that as we talk about infrastructure, that we'll be willing to talk more about putting more resources into upgrading our power grid and into energy storage. We need to be thinking forward, not just trying to glue things together from the past. And we've got to be making this shift to clean energy. It is the future, and we need to reach that future urgently.
Mhm. You mentioned about the upcoming Senate bill, the stimulus bill, and we have a question here from Higher Ed asking, would you be advocating for financial support in the Higher Ed bill, in particular for research development funding?
Yes. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned this. So the answer is yes.
Yeah.
You know, in the third package, the one that passed in March, or was that the second? It's the one that passed in March, the big one, the CARES Act that passed in March.
$2 billion.
We had a good amount, a good chunk, about $100 billion that ended up going in and was used in part for colleges and universities all across the country for higher ed. And I think that was the right thing to do. But it was mostly just to try to staunch the hemorrhaging that was going on because, as you know, colleges and universities, they shut down. They gave money back to kids who'd already paid for their dorm rooms in advance. But the university was still having to make its mortgage payments. They were really under a lot of squeeze and having to upgrade their technology and make sure every student had access to technology. So there was a lot of stress on our colleges and universities, and there will be going forward. But it is particularly important, the part you just mentioned, to make sure that we are maintaining and expanding federal funding for the research function of our colleges, our universities, NIH, CDC, BARDA. I want all of it. I want to make sure that we're putting the money into research. This is our lifeblood. A pandemic should be showing this to us up close and personal, and it's not just medical research. It's all of the research. It's our basic research. It's about energy. It's about climate. It's about resilience. It's about the kind of world we have going forward. So I always figure if the senior senator from Massachusetts can't be the one to lead the charge on putting more money into research, then there's something wrong here. So count me in. This is a fight I'm in all the way. And we're doing well in the House bill, not as well as I want to do. And I'm hoping that we can actually up it in the Senate bill. At least I'm sure going to be fighting for that.
Well, this is a question from some of your friends from Harvard University. The Boston Globe ran an article recently that called Scientific Research another casualty on the pandemic, referring to the scaling back of non-COVID-19 research on the college campuses. These labs are incurring substantial costs to preserve their work and to keep their research teams together. And they're going to incur even more costs to get back up and running. So we're grateful to you, Senator, that you joined your colleague, Senator Markey, and many of your other colleagues on a letter asking for $26 billion to support our federal research agencies to cover these critical short-term research costs. And what are the prospects for this kind of support? And what more can we be doing to make this case, including as part of the next relief package?
So the prospects are better every time I have a chance, and Senator Markey has a chance, to speak with a senator who represents a state that has a major research university. You know, this is one of these, you do lots of quiet conversations in the background to try to remind people why this is so vitally important. I worry that there has been research that has been set back by years because of both the crimp in funding and the fact that people couldn't go into their labs in some areas for a period of time. So trying to open that back up and make sure there's enough funding to come in to support this work, even when universities are feeling stressed elsewhere, I think is absolutely critical, and keeping that as a funding stream. But you could be helpful on this. Everybody who's with us today could be helpful on this. Your Massachusetts delegation is good.
Right.
We need more allies in the Senate. Please, please, please get in touch with your colleagues around the country. Every place where research is being done, urge them to make it a priority to get in touch with their senators. And I say this, whether their senators are Democrats or Republicans, everybody reaching out to their senators is good. Because if they're Republicans, it's to try to get them, when we're negotiating on this bill and compromising, that they will come along with us on $26 billion. If they're Democrats, it's to get them to move it up in the pecking order of their priorities. So please, please, please think about it today. Think about the organizations you belong to. Think about where the people you went to school with are now located and the kind of work they're doing. Think about your co-PIs in other locations, whatever it is. But reach out to those folks, ask them to get in touch with their senators, ask them to call, ask them to email, ask them to send a letter, ask them to do a letter to the editor in order to put some pressure to say this is a priority for the American people. There's so much need right now in so many areas. We got to find a way to raise the profile of this one, and that's the way to do it. So please reach out.
Right. And I think we're blessed in the New England congressional delegation. I think they get it. All the senators, all the members of that, we're blessed. Another question for you. As our economy begins to slowly reopen, many businesses of all types and sizes are concerned about an onslaught of frivolous lawsuits. I've asked the Congress to enact temporarily targeted liability relief legislation related to the pandemic. In fact, this issue has become a sticking point, as you are well aware, with the Republicans that control the Senate for passing any additional major relief package. I think Senator McConnell called it the red line. We have heard that there is a proposal in the works from Republican leadership, and we're interested to know what you are hearing and what your views are on some kind of targeted safe harbor for businesses who are working hard to comply with public health guidelines.
So look, we have to start with the fact that the law says as long as you take reasonable precautions, that's all that's required. No one is liable simply because an employee got sick or a customer came in and got sick. Liability is based on a reasonableness standard. And the idea that Republicans want to come in and say, we're going to say there's no standard at all, absolute liability, nobody can bring any lawsuit, any accountability, no matter how dangerous the conditions were. For me, that's just a non-starter, because this is how I think about it. Look, the kinds of things that you could be held liable for is if you're not following basic safety standards. So you cram a bunch of people together, nobody has masks available, you fail to wipe down common areas that lots of people are touching. We just had a hearing about this this morning in the banking hearing. And one of the issues we were talking about is what's it going to take for customers to come back? And for this, by the way, I quoted the president of the Chamber of Commerce, who had said, you can change the legal standards, you can, businesses can reopen their doors, but if employees and customers don't feel safe, they're not coming back. So saying, but we're going to change the legal standards, so no matter how filthy stuff is, you have no legal recourse, I don't think that's going to give people more confidence. I think it's going to push it in exactly the opposite direction. I think a reasonableness standard is the place we ought to be. And if you're following current healthcare guidelines, even if those guidelines change in the future, if you're following reasonable healthcare guidelines, then you're going to be safe under the law. And I think that's how it should be. But if you're really, really not doing that, I think there ought to be accountability. And I think reassuring the public and your employees that there will be accountability actually helps us all get this economy open again faster.
Good. I have a question here from someone who works in the mental health field. And the question is, according to a recent study, unemployment, isolation, uncertainty about the future due to COVID-19 could lead to 75,000 deaths from substance abuse and suicide. That is almost as many as the deaths caused directly by the COVID-19. Is there a role for the federal government to provide some increased need for treatment and funding?
Yes, there is. In the most recent bill, when we put $100 billion into hospitals and testing, part of the money that went into hospitals was to try to get some money into mental health resources for people. We know the needs are going to be greater than ever. And I want to say, I am really impressed by people in the mental health field who have tried to adjust under these difficult circumstances, that there's been more telemedicine, and to insurance companies that have stepped up and said they would reimburse for telemedicine. I don't mean that it's perfect, it's not, but it's moved us in the right direction and said we're in this together. For me, this is just a straightforward, the federal government needs to be putting more resources here. This is one of the consequences of COVID-19, is that more people are under more stress and the delivery of mental health services is under more stress. The whole healthcare system is. We've got to get some money in there so that there's support for the people who need it and for those who are trying to supply the help to those people.
There's a question here on oversight. You touched on it earlier, but if you were wearing a different hat and you were the Secretary of the Treasury, what would you be recommending and how we would be dispersing all of the PPP, all of the Main Street funding? What would you be doing differently than Secretary Mnuchin would be doing?
So think of it this way. Start out with the fact that there are really two very different buckets of funding. There's the PPP bucket, which is the Payroll Protection Act. This is for the little businesses. You can't have more than 500 employees to be eligible for this. And this has a lot of loan forgiveness in it. What I'd be doing with that one is make all the rules as clear as you can, as simple as you can, and get that money pushed out the door for every small business that needs it. Congress, Treasury Secretary can't do this by himself. Congress needs to come in and actually add to that fund so there's more restart-up money. I think that's where we're going to have the biggest need with small businesses that had to shut down. It's not free to restock your shelves and clean up and buy the new protective gear that you need. And for these businesses that haven't had any money coming in, that's going to be a real problem. So that's what I'd be doing for the little businesses. I'd also, as we put in this latest bill, the Democrats got in, it was important to fence off part of this money to make sure that it went to the tiniest businesses, the mom and pops, the 1 employee, 3 employees kind of businesses, to make sure that it went to communities of color, that it went to community development banks, those who are investing in local communities and in economically distressed communities. It was important to make sure that money was there. The whole PPP had originally been written kind of with a vision in mind of everybody who has a personal relationship with their banker. And that does not represent a lot of very small businesses in our Commonwealth and across America. So that's where I'd be on PPP. The other one, this is the one that's basically about $450 billion that's largely just a slush fund. It has very few restrictions on how that money can be spent. The Secretary of the Treasury can use it as first loss money to then back up and create more loans with the Fed. So potentially it means about $4 trillion worth of money that's available that can be pumped into the economy through the Secretary of Treasury and through the Fed. Now, the way the statute reads, it says the Secretary of the Treasury is the one who basically sets up what the rules are going to be. So here's what I do. I would say part one about the rules is we're going to make them very transparent. We're going to write them out. Everybody can see them. Anybody can comment on them. Part two is it's got to be about employment. We're not here, we didn't put federal taxpayer dollars in so that these businesses could pay a handful of executives so that they could swallow up other businesses or so that they could make big distributions to their shareholders. That the measure of getting this money is what is your plan for keeping people employed. I realize there needs to be some flexibility about it, but that for me, that's the driving point, because this is about putting it's not about watering the tops of the trees, it's about watering the roots of the trees. And that means in our economy, getting that money into families' hands, that's how we strengthen and build the economy going forward. The third part is there's going to be serious oversight. And that is, if you come in and make certain representations and then don't stick with those representations, there's going to be serious liability for that. That's why we have inspectors general. We should have them for this program. We've got to make sure everybody follows the rules.
Mhm. Would you, obviously, I think I know the answer, but you're in favor of expanding the forgiveness under the PPP program?
yeah. Yes, yes, yes.
Extending forgiveness from 8 weeks to whatever, 24 weeks?
Yeah. I
You're in
think the
favor.
latest we're talking about is 24 weeks, and I'm all
Yeah.
in on that. I
Right,
think that's exactly, I'm sorry I didn't mention it on my own, but that's
Okay.
exactly right.
I got another question here. Retirement savings. With retirement savings taking a big hit during this crisis as millions of Americans are taking a hardship withdrawal, what can be done to give incentives to people to replenish their retirement accounts?
Oh, that's a really good question because, as you know, every year that goes by, Americans have to rely more on money they've personally put aside rather than on the Social Security system or government-sponsored, employer-sponsored retirement plans. I think one of the things we've done this year, which I think was the right thing to do, was to say people don't have to take distributions. Now, this is for people who are already at 70 and a half, to minimize the number of people taking money out if they don't need to. But you're asking the question from the other direction, and that is people who are having to take it out.
Right.
And I hate to say it, I think we're right to say we should relax those tax penalties because people need this money and they're relying on this money. But we should be talking together, and I'm open to thoughts from this group about how it is we can get people to put more money back in as the economy recovers, whether that's through tax breaks, whether there are other forms of doing this. But retirement security, this is one of the big issues on the horizon for millions and millions of people. And we're not in a good place on that. So I appreciate you raising the issue.
Right.
I'm not sure we have good answers on it yet.
I think we've already touched on this about the state and local tax revenue. The senator, states and municipalities are very concerned about the effects the pandemic has had on their tax receipts. Can you tell us if you're supportive of measures to provide assistance to cities and towns as they try to meet their, obviously you are, that's why you want to advocate in the Senate bill is, is it, how much did you say for state and local government?
So we did $100 billion in the most recent, but that is not nearly enough.
Right.
And let me just say on this, it's both hands. If we want to keep people well, then we need to put money into state and local government because that's a big part of what they do. And they do it both by supporting hospitals, but they do it by supporting public health. They do it by helping homeless people get off the streets, lots and lots of ways, making sure people get fed through food banks. So you want to put money into state and local government. If you want to help the economy recover, you want to put money into state and local government. So right now, here we are with state and local government, expenses have gone through the roof and revenue has dropped through the basement, right? So they're in the worst of all situations. I'm talking to mayors around Massachusetts who say their first line of layoffs could be 20% of their workforce. When you're in an economic recession or depression, the last thing you want to do is have state and local government laying people off. You want them to be hiring more people. And they would do that if we would make the money available. And this is one of those, as everyone I know knows on this call, you can't solve this at the state level. This is why we have a federal government. Only the federal government can print the money and make the resources available in order for state and local government to have the money that they need to make. If we ratchet back, if they have to ratchet back on their spending, that is pro-cyclical. We need to be counter-cyclical. That is the job of government at this point. So I got so carried away and knocked something off the table here.
Good. Well, the National League,
I really feel strongly about this one, Jim.
obviously, the National League of Cities has indicated that they think 90% of cities will expect the shortfall.
Yeah.
So obviously they're looking for help. We had the governor Charlie Baker on just recently, and we asked, what do you think your budget shortfall is going to be going forward, the new fiscal year, because of COVID-19? And he said, quite frankly, we're estimating that now it's between $3 billion to $6 billion. Under the CARES Act, I think he got 2.6 billion. So obviously, I don't think he's any different than Connecticut or Rhode Island, that they're going to be all looking for a major shortfall in their future 21 budget. So any help that can be given to them, you're there, I know that, but they are really bleeding, to say the least. And it'd be terrible to see layoffs of public safety officers, being the first casualties as well. So thank you for your support there. Couple others before we leave. Trade. Earlier this year, you broke with some of your progressive colleagues and voted in favor of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which modernized our trade relationships with these two key economic partners. Needless to say, the New England Council was a very strong supporter of this new trade deal, and we're very grateful for your support. Can you tell us more about your decision and why you supported the agreement?
So look, the way I saw this is the trade deal was not everything we wanted, not by any stretch. But they had taken some of the worst parts out. There were some parts in pharmaceuticals that I thought were really bad. And they had made some things better about manufacturing here in the US and keeping markets in ways that were favorable to the US. So my view on this was take a half a loaf, and come back and negotiate for the other half. Let's get back into those negotiations and talk about the rest of the places where we need to make changes in our trade policy. But I appreciate all of the thoughts that people shared with me during this. And that was just how I saw it. Let's take what we can get now, come back tomorrow and negotiate for some more.
Great. A transportation question. What is the Senator's plan to advocate for a renewed transportation funding bill to replace the FAST Act?
So what I'd like to do is, this is one of the sort of big questions, the 10,000-foot question. Are we going to do a big infrastructure bill? And if so, is transportation and energy are two big parts of that if we move forward on this? I very much support our doing that, but that's real money into transportation, and being able to put that money, not just into highways, be able to put that money into mass transit. We have needed for a long time in Massachusetts. I don't have to tell you all. We need rail out west, and we need rail headed down south. We need to get the link all the way through. And I strongly support both of these, as does the entire Massachusetts delegation. And I will say on this one, what makes me a little more hopeful is with Richie Neal now in such an important position in the House with his hand on the budget. I am hopeful that in the next round, we will start making a real investment in transportation. It's critical to us economically and critical to us for climate reasons.
A quick question on elections. We're now 5 months away from the presidential election. There continues to be grave concerns about the safety of in-person voting. The president and other Republicans have been pretty firmly against voting by mail. Your views on this topic? Do you think we can maintain the integrity of the election while also allowing people to stay safe by not actually going out to the polling locations?
No American citizen should be forced to choose between protecting their health and exercising their right to vote as an American citizen. And that means in a time of a health crisis, every American citizen should have access to vote by mail. You were mentioning right at the top, Jim, and I appreciate it. It was very generous of you to do so. You were talking about the things I'd gotten into the House bill. I figured out we have a majority over in the House. So I've been working with those guys, right? Trying to get this in the base bill. Don't just wait till it comes over to the Senate. But one of the things that is also in that bill is support for vote by mail. So it puts money into making sure that every citizen gets a ballot mailed to them, postage prepaid. It also puts money into vote in person, because there are a lot of people who want to be able to vote in person. A lot of folks, a lot of communities where voting in person matters. So protecting it, making sure that workers are fully protected, have protective gear, that there are enough polling places, and early voting and online registration. In addition to that, it's support for the post office. If we're going to protect our voting, we also have to protect the post office. And we know the Republicans have been trying to privatize the post office for years now. We don't want to let them use this pandemic when revenues are down and costs are up for the post office as their chance to start nailing the coffin shut on the post office. We can't do that. So in the voting proposal in the House is also money for the post office to make sure it'll be able to handle it, and just in general to make sure that it is secure and safe. You know, of all the things we talk about, it's voting. It's the beating heart of our democracy. It's how we hold our elected officials accountable. And it should not be a partisan issue. Democrats and Republicans should want to make it easy and safe for every single American citizen to vote. That's part of our birthright. And we should be fighting for that every single day. So this is a big part of what's in the proposal going forward, and one that if we have to fight Mitch McConnell on it in the Senate, then we will fight him on it. But we need to have that showdown, and we need to have it now, because we need those procedures in place yesterday, not delaying until after the November election is over. Our democracy depends on it.
I was listening to former Majority Leader Tom Daschle recently, and he said he has never seen the United States Senate so polarized.
Oh, I know.
So partisan. And your thoughts, I think you've already indicated you'd like to do away with the filibuster. Your thoughts on how we can get more bills to the floor, get more bipartisanship support. I mean, there's some people that talked about if the bill gets a majority in the committee, it should come to the floor to be voted up or down. But your thoughts on how we can just, you know, avoid the gridlock that seems to be occurring in the United States Senate?
No, I think gridlock is the wrong way to look at this, Jim. Understand this: when certain bills don't pass, or a lot of bills don't pass, that's good for somebody, right? And look at it the other way. When the Republicans wanted to pass a $1.5 trillion tax break, it took them 5 weeks, and they got it done. I mean, they just moved in, sat down, wrote the bill, and passed it. So I think of this as what's going on in Washington is we've got one party that doesn't want to change the rules around climate, doesn't want to change the rules around student loan debt, doesn't want to change the rules around access to health care, doesn't want to change the rules around taxation. And that when you've got one party that doesn't want to do anything and one party that does, that's the better way to understand this dispute. It's not just a kind of, I don't want to do what you want to do and you don't want to do what I want to do. It's really much more, what do you think is the fundamental role of government? So I'll pitch it this way. I think the best way we fix this is we actually start making government work for a lot of people. There are so many people right now who are so discouraged and feel like government doesn't work for them. Think about what it would be like right now to be 25 years old, and what is your principal experience with the federal government? And the answer is it's a debt collector to come after you for $70,000 worth of student loan debt. We need a government that keeps thinking about opportunity and how we build more opportunity, how we make the investments in education and in research, in the kind of things that help us build a future. So I think that's what this is about. And I'm getting a note that I have to go vote.
I understand. My $10,000 question is, has anyone from Delaware asked for your tax returns for the last 2 years?
My tax returns are online, Jim. Anybody can take a look. So
Have you had any conversations with anybody from Delaware in the last days?
I'm not going to talk about private conversations. Nice try, Jim, but I'm not going to.
Brian, I was just between you and me anyways. Wasn't going to
Oh,
believe.
okay.
Senator, thank you very much for your time and your passion, your advocacy, and you have an awful lot on the plate, and we're glad you're there on behalf of not only just Massachusetts, but for the country. You reflect so well on all of us. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
All right, thank you.
Take care.
All right, thank you. I tried.